Okay, today we're going to talk about Korea and Japan in ancient times, obviously. And we're going to look at how mostly the biggest thing is what they got from China, how they developed kind of side by side with China. Okay, so Korea, a little bit on the geography. Peninsula attached to China. It's heavy in mountains, little farmland. Farmland is mostly in the coastal area. They grow wheat in the north, rice in the south. The rivers are longer and more navigable than Japan's, but the north is cooler than the south, and monsoons affect the climate of both regions. South has more fertile farmland, but the north is rich in minerals. And as we know today, Korea is divided. Um, but a lot of Korean culture was taken, I guess, or diffused from China and Japan because it's kind of an avenue between. So early in Korean history, um, it became the Korean civilization evolves after China, but before Japan, because it's the avenue of cultural diffusion from China to Japan. It was ruled by several rival kingdoms, which were constantly at war with each other, and you can see them on the map with the timelines. Okay, in 935, the kingdoms are replaced by what's known as the Koryo dynasty. In 1392, the Koryo are replaced by the Yi, and the Yi rules for 500 years, so into modern times, around 1910. Okay, Korea's culture is partly original, partly borrowed. They adopted Confucianism and Buddhism from China. They also adopted communism from China. Korea also borrowed China's writing, but eventually develops an alphabet of 24 characters. They value education, also use the civil service system, similar to China. They use movable type with the individual letters 200 years before Europe does. Korea is always considered China, Japan, and the Mongols as threats because they're a small country and they're kind of caught in between these more powerful groups. Okay, moving on to Japan. Japan is what's known as an archipelago, which is simply a term for a group of many islands. There are four main islands and a whole lot of smaller ones. The largest island is Honshu, the big island here where Tokyo and most of the major cities are, ones that you've heard of: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Osaka, Kobe, Nagano, where the Olympics were several years ago. And it was also where the big earthquake was a few years ago. Okay. Facts of Japan's location: surrounded by water, Pacific Ocean on the east, Sea of Japan in between the mainland. It's 100 miles from Korea, 700 miles from China. It's only a few hundred miles from Russia. Japan has been able to remain culturally independent from the rest of Asia because it's an island, but it has borrowed a lot of ideas and technologies from both China and Korea. In its history, it's used its location to remain isolated for long periods. However, its economic existence depends heavily on world trade because Korea has very little natural resources. Over three-fourths of Japan is mountainous. This fact creates problems. Buildings and transportation networks are sometimes threatened by volcanoes and earthquakes, the tsunami and all that we know of that happened a few years ago. They're still recovering from that. Only a small percentage of the land is arable that can be used for farming. And there's not a lot of living space, so everybody crowds into these urban population centers. They've tried to overcome the scarcity of farmland in four ways. They're fishermen. Japan is one of the major fishing nations of the world. They still whale and hunt whales. They use terrace farming that we've talked a little bit about. We will get into more down the road. Basically building a series of like decks off the mountains to increase land. Use very intensive farming methods. They try to use every available acre of land, and they make up for shortages by importing. They build a lot of high rises to adjust for the lack of land in big cities and the high population density. The rivers are not really navigable. They're too short. There's a lot of rapids. So they don't use them for transportation, but they are used for irrigation. Okay. Climate and natural disasters. Japan has a temperate climate, which means it's a similar climate to our own. Mildly warm summers, mildly cold winters. More extreme temperatures are in the south. Obviously, the north is the coldest. Each year, more than 1,000 earthquake tremors shake Japan. They also have 30 active volcanoes. You see Mount Fuji here on the left. And the islands are subject to high winds, which are called typhoons, and tsunamis, which we know of, that are caused by earthquakes. Okay. Forces of nature play an important role in the religion of Japan. The religion is called Shinto. You may remember it from your religion park project back in the fall. People of ancient Japan are awestruck by the forces of nature, and the Shinto religion grows out of that, this response to the violence of nature, the tsunamis, the earthquakes, the volcanoes. Shinto's central belief is that spirits inhabit and control natural objects such as mountains, rivers, and winds, and it emphasizes a respect for ancestors and loyalty to family and nation. And it's really kind of the unifying principle in all of Japanese life. It came into play during World War II with the dive bombers and the kamikazes. It was all part of this ideas of Shinto being used. Resource shortages have always had to overcome by the Japanese. In addition to farmland, they don't have oil, they don't have iron, they don't have coal. So when they came to industrialization, they had to import the raw materials and export the finished goods, and that is how Japan makes its money today. This is one of the reasons that World War II happened in the Pacific, because it was the Japanese looking for resources and the Americans trying to rein them in, and you had a conflict. Mr. Hyland will get into that in more detail. Now, Japan's early history. They borrowed a lot of culture from abroad. Okay, it did not originate in a river valley. They acquired their civilization largely by learning all that they could from the much older civilization of nearby China. 7th century AD, a Japanese prince decided to visit China, and the prince orders members of his court to travel China and learn all the aspects of their civilization. They study arts, religion, philosophy, government, and language. And when they came back, they taught that to Japan's leading families. And they developed they developed it first from Chinese, but eventually they work on some different ones. They're similar, but different from Chinese. Major religion, the other major religion besides Shinto is Buddhism, and that spread from India to China to Korea and then out to Japan. Just like the Chinese, the Japanese modify it to suit their own culture. Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines coexist, and they're located throughout Japan. Okay. Japan has what's known as a feudal period, just like Europe, and which Europe's occurs 400 years earlier, but the Japanese still have this period, and it evolves almost totally independent of what goes on in Europe, but it's very, very similar. We'll talk a little bit about it in class. In 1200s and 1300s, the social and economic system in both Europe and Japan is feudalism. Cultural diffusion does not occur and doesn't account for the coincidence. There was absolutely no records of any contact between Japan and Europe. In Japan, as it did in Europe, feudalism was a system in which lords, large landowners, obtained military service by those who had pledged loyalty to them. A feudal lord could raise an army by calling warriors who owed him allegiance, and in Europe, these are called knights. In Japan, they're called samurai. Acting as military commanders, the feudal lords would lead their samurai into battle, and but it also had a whole structure, just like in Europe. Okay, was that all people knows the characteristics? Everybody knows their place, and it's a very rigid class system. Peasants on the bottom, samurai on top, and there's also a whole bunch of subgroups, as you can see. Okay, so the samurai make up the paid military caste. They're the same as the knights in Europe. They follow a strict code of the ideal warrior called the Bushido, or the way of the warrior. They're expected to defend their lord to death. His prized possession is his sword. If he's defeated or disgraced, he's supposed to commit harikari or a ritual suicide rather than dishonor the code. Okay, and you can see the code on the right. It's very similar in makeup to the code of chivalry. Okay, Japan's most powerful feudal lords are in charge of large regions. The lord who is appointed to govern the country as a whole is known as the shogun, and the shogun is the leader of the strongest family or clan in Japan. After the appointed shogun runs the government, the emperor does little more than serve as a religious leader and a symbol of unity. The phrase is that he reigns, but he does not rule. The emperor is thought to be a god or a descendant of the gods, and he can't sully himself or dirty himself by actually getting involved in day-to-day government. Okay. A little bit on Japanese art. In feudal Japan, a distinctive culture develops. The art of the feudal period reflects Shinto's belief that nature is divine and should be worshipped. They have these painted screens that reflect nature. The Japanese have a whole tea ceremony, and it's meant to put people in touch with their inner spirit. Origami involves folding paper and flour into animal shapes. Poets write haikus, which you may have done in an English class somewhere there, where usually the subject matter is nature, and Japanese people consider their gardens to be works of art. And you can see some examples of origami and what is known as a bonsai garden on the bottom of the page. Okay, so I'd like you to go in and do the Google form that is attached on either Edmodo or Google Classroom.